So 3 years ago, we actually were right here in this hall. The Egyptian Student Association was hosting an event to inform everyone about the Egyptian Revolution, and events changed, and Mubarak was ousted, and instead it was a celebration 3 years ago. And today we are not celebrating, so there must be a reason for that, and we'll let the panel talk about that, I guess. I'm Tariq Raha, I'm the president of the Egyptian Student Association at MIT. So we are co-hosting this event with the Aga Khan Documentation Center, represented by Sharon Smith right here in the beginning. So if you can, please, Sharon, please thank everyone for helping us. So the Egyptian Student Association aims to build ties between Egypt and MIT, and one of our objectives is to have Egyptian culture present on the MIT campus, and one of its activities is always screening movies. We screened The Square before, and now we're screening We Are Egypt. We have the director, Lillie Paquette, over here, and thank you, Lillie, for coming and for offering this very interesting documentary. We will have a lot of time with the panel to talk about this, so without further ado, I would just like to thank the board and members of the Egyptian Student Association, MIT EV, and the CAC, and also Sharon and the Aga Khan Documentation Center. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. I'm going to introduce our moderator for tonight, and in turn, Professor Nasser Rabbat will be taking over the moderation of this event. And thank you very much for coming. Professor Nasser is the Aga Khan Professor and the Director of the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture at MIT, an architect and a historian. His scholarly interests include Islamic architecture, art and cultures, urban history, and post-colonial criticism. In his research and teaching, he presents architecture in ways that illuminate its interaction with politics, culture, and society, and stress the role of human agency in shaping that interplay. Professor Rabbat has published more than 100 scholarly articles and book sections and a number of books. His most recent books are Mamluk History Through Architecture, Building, Culture, and Politics in Mamluk Egypt and Syria, London 2010. Rabbat regularly contributes to a number of Arabic newspapers, consults with international design firms on projects in the Islamic world, and maintains several websites dedicated to Islamic architecture and urbanism. Thank you, Professor Nasser.
Okay, panelists, please.
I have a very limited role in here. Basically, moderator means timekeeper more than anything else. We do have actually 4 very interesting panelists. One of them is the movie director and maker, and I would like to give them all the opportunity to speak, and I'm going to try to at least actually direct the attention of each and every one of them to an aspect that I think would be relevant to their own interest and to their own work. And I hope to be able to leave some time for questions from the audience at the end, because I'm sure actually many of you might have much more interesting questions than I can think of myself and ask to the panelists. But the first role is actually to introduce the panelists. And I will start with Lillie, because she is the pivot of the event today. Lillie was born in Peru and raised in Colombia and Venezuela. She's a Canadian-American filmmaker who recently directed and produced this documentary. She is an international affair, or she was an international affair analyst, or you are now actually, with an MA Global Studies from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. She has worked as a reporter and video news reporter for Reuters prior to her filmmaking career. She also worked for several years on Middle Eastern and North African programs at the Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit International Research and Exchanges Board, IREX, where she specialized in U.S. State Department-funded media and civil society development programs. She lives here in Boston. That prior work of yours actually somehow gives you away, because it appears that this is what interests you in Egypt, in a sense that funding of activities in democracies and media monitoring. It seems that you brought some of that back. Yeah, yeah. Our second panelist is Soha Bayoumi, who's a lecturer at the Department of the History of Science at Harvard University. Received her PhD in 2012 from Sciences Po in Paris in political philosophy, and she works on the question of justice at the intersection of political philosophy, intellectual history, and science and technology studies. She taught European and American intellectual history as well as the intellectual history of the modern and contemporary Middle East, and is currently co-authoring a book with Shireen Hamdi from Brown University about the role of doctors in the Egyptian Revolution, and working also on the book manuscript on the normative links between liberalism and socialism. Next we have Mohammed Helal, who's a SJD candidate at Harvard Law School and the teaching fellow at the Kennedy School of Government. Between 2005-2009, he advised the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Egypt on matters relating to the United Nations and multilateral organizations. Before that, he was a legal officer in the cabinet of the Secretary General of the Arab League, Mr. Amr Moussa, who recently was the head of the Constitution Drafting Committee. He was also the chief legal officer of the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry that investigated human rights abuses committed during the 2011 protests, and that gave many of us the hope that some Arab regime might actually look back and take responsibility for what their regimes have done. To no avail, I should say, in Bahrain, but the ceremony itself was actually quite uplifting when it happened. He taught human rights law at the American University in Cairo and has recently published a book titled The Second Republic in Egypt, From Dar al-Shuruq in Egypt. Our last but not least is Adel Iskander, who is a scholar of Arab studies at Georgetown University and whose research focuses on media and communication. His previous works include Egypt in Flux, essays of an unfinished revolution that came out from AUC Press, then Al Jazeera, the story of the network that is rattling government and redefining modern journalism, and then Edward Said, a legacy of emancipation and representation, came out of the University of California Press, and Mediating the Arab Uprising, Tadween Publishing. Let me start with you, Lillie, if I may, and ask you to perhaps comment on two moments with the hindsight, of course, of where we stand today and how you chose to finish your film with that very sort of like ominous sentence that the revolution continues. Do you think that the revolution continue? And perhaps another question related to it is that you went with a certain project in mind to Egypt, and it seems to me that the events have led you to sort of like refocus your project in a certain way, even though you did the extremely intelligent move at the end of it, of refusing to bring yourself to cover the revolution and maintaining that notion of I am constructing what led to the revolution. And I have a little bit of perhaps a criticism in there is that Tunisia is not mentioned at all. So.
Yikes. You touched on some very important things. The first I'll talk about is how difficult it is to finish a film that continues unfolding. Like the story just won't stop. And so there's been many edits of this film. And the postscript at the end was redone, I don't know how many times in order to like cut it off to where it was going. That final line, "The revolution continues," was given to me by a dear professor, a friend of mine at Harvard, who said, let's put that at the end. And I was like, I had a lot of advice from different people who watched it over and over, and I felt very grateful for the whole editorial process. But I guess, yeah, maybe that's sort of like Professor Iskander's title to his book, The Revolution Unfinished. So, and the way I like to look at this, and I'm just, from my view and from what I understand and from what I've seen in Egypt, and what I constantly tell people is that this story isn't any part of it's not the beginning, it's not the end, it's just a very small portion, like a snapshot of the history that's been going on for a long time and which is going to continue going. The part about, I think the next, I'm not sure in which order your comments were, but the part about choosing not to go back to Egypt while all this was unfolding. As you can imagine, I was like really just super just taken by the events of January and February 2011, and I really wanted to go back, and I was like, how could I have left just beforehand? And in fact, lots of the activists were always telling me this, like I mentioned in the film, like, don't leave, things are just about to happen. And I'm like, yes, I never planned to be here for a year and a half, but things keep happening and I keep staying. So I actually made this decision to pull myself away so that I could develop it into a film, so that I could have something, because if not, I was just going to film endlessly. So in fact, when the revolution started unfolding, I did consider going back, and I was like, okay, I should go back. And I was like, no, learn your lesson, darn it. Like you keep going back into this, and Mubarak's going to shut this down, and nothing's going to happen, and they're all going to go to jail, and it's going to be the same kind of story. I actually didn't think, like anyone, no one expected something the way it ended up to go. So I did. I kicked myself for a long time that I didn't go, and then I finally had to make peace with myself, actually, that I took a moment of this amazing history, and no, it's not my story, and this is their story, and I'd love to continue being a part of it, but in order to turn it into anything, I had to choose a space for it. And then I also made peace with the fact that lots of people went to Egypt at that time to make films, and everyone I knew and their brother was going to Egypt to make a film. And but I remember at the time in Egypt when I was there, and people were like, "Why are you filming? This stuff is happening over and over, and if anything did ever happen in Egypt, you'd have gold." And I'm like, "Well, yeah, I guess so." But that wasn't really my goal originally. My goal was to shed light on this to American citizens mostly, about where their money is going and where their funding for democracy is actually headed. If Americans even know that we're funding democracy promotion programs abroad. And I just felt like I had done my master's degree focused on this subject, so my whole thesis was involved with, was focusing on U.S.-Egypt relations and this history, and of course that's all steeped in your other comment about me having worked in Washington, D.C. on all these State Department programs. And I just found a huge, at the time, this huge discrepancy or divide between, on one hand, the U.S. government is supporting all this democracy promotion in the world, and on the other hand, we're still supporting, the dictators that we like. And so that's sort of a narrative that I really wanted to bring up for a Western and mostly American audience. I hope I touched on all
Yes,
of
you
these.
did. Thank you. Ahmed, perhaps actually I'll ask you the next question, which is, you seem to have actually been close to some of the decision makers prior. I mean, Amr Moussa, in a sense, I assume that you've worked with him. And I wonder if you could sort of like put a perspective for us about the other part of the potential opposition to the regime, which is sort of like a milder, perhaps more mature, more steeped in the traditions, in the political traditions of Egypt, and how were they faring in the period that this film is covering, all the way down to the beginning of the revolution. We know that there were few changes of positions. We saw al-Baradei, and there was actually a very diplomatic way of somehow telling us that al-Baradei is not going to fulfill the hopes of the Egyptian people, the way we had two of the commentators in the film saying that it's not very clear what he's doing. We're not understanding what he's doing. So perhaps you could sort of like somehow widen the perspective for us on the existing or pre-existing political culture and political class in Egypt. And I'm assuming that Amr Moussa could be a good example. I don't know if you can bring that in. Perhaps the second question, since you were involved in Bahrain, and this would be a speculative question, and that is in the film, at the end, when Lillie is speaking to her favorite activist who gets all the close-ups, we actually have him say that he is extremely disappointed at the blood. And we do realize now, 3 years after the revolution, that there has been no legal action whatsoever as to who is responsible for the bloodshed at the different stages of the Egyptian revolution all the way down to the present. Is there anything happening in that direction? Is there any discourse actually around how can the Egyptian people now obtain justice for harm done to them by the three regimes that we have witnessed, Mubarak, the military SCAF, and then ultimately the Muslim Brotherhood, and now back to a new form of SCAF?
Thank you. You know, the problem of being a lawyer and a diplomat is the first thing I need to do is to issue a disclaimer. And so my disclaimer is that everything I say is strictly my opinion and obviously does not represent the opinion or position of the government of Egypt, or really of any government of Egypt that has come by and gone in the past few years. As you introduced me, I've not been part of the government bureaucracy of Egypt for the past 5 years now. So whatever I say really is dated. On your first question, I worked with Amr Moussa, who was at the time the Secretary General of the Arab League, 2002, 2003, so he had left his official position in government for a while. You know, he was not working for the Egyptian government, he was the Secretary General of the Arab League. I don't exactly understand what you mean by the milder opposition and expanding.
Actually, Baradei is the person that I'm thinking of really. I mean, milder in the sense, maybe actually maturer, more steeped in the political culture of Egypt,
well,
as opposed to the revolutionaries that we basically saw covered in the film.
In absolute honesty, I would say that the revolutionaries were more steeped in Egyptian politics than Mohammed Baradei. I think these were people who had spent a few years on the ground. One of them was mentioning in the film that there were different waves of protests, starting with the Second Intifada in 2001. There was another wave of popular unrest around the Iraq War in 2003. There was another wave in 2006 with the labor unrest. These are just major milestones. So if anything, I would actually say that these people had a lot more roots on the ground. They had a lot more political experience on the ground. They might have not had the political apparatus that could support their activism and transfer that political activity into political gains, sort of electoral gains. I think Mohammed Baradei was a completely different animal, and please feel free to contradict me, but really not as a foreign officer or anything but just as an Egyptian. I think that when he returned in, I think it was late 2009, early 2010, he presented an opportunity for a third way, because Egyptians have always been told this narrative that it's really either us, namely the regime, the National Democratic Party, or the Muslim Brotherhood. And the film brings that out. And there was the 2005 election, they had 88 seats in parliament, and so that was a sign for everyone that if you don't like the National Democratic Party, look at what's in store for you. Mohammed Baradei, at least in 2009, 2010, definitely added an element that hadn't existed in Egyptian politics, I would say, since 1975, when politics and parties were reintroduced to Egypt from the one-party system we had from 1954 to 1975. And the option he presented was, listen, I'm not an Islamist. I'm not a regime figure, and I'm electable. I am an international figure. I have the aura and name recognition that potentially could be electable. And I think before the revolution, before the uprising, I think to many Egyptians, that's what he represented. What happened afterward is a different story. But if commenting on that period, I think that, personally I had left, but I think that there was genuine concern for what he represented. Because he basically broke down this binary political landscape that Egyptians had been presented with. It's either or, right? And he provided a very reasonable and a very attractive third option for a lot of Egyptians that simply didn't support either options or weren't completely enamored by either options. On your second point, no, I don't. it's really quite ironic that we have a Ministry of Transitional Justice at the moment, but there's really not a lot of transitioning or justice that's going on. You know, you can see that very clearly. But I think to understand why is more important. So, you know, to answer your question, not much has happened. And
I was hoping that
you
say
told
why.
me I would go there. Okay. It's an incredibly complicated question, and part of it, very briefly. Okay, part of it is actually legal and legislative, because without going into a course on criminal law, basically, if one person murdered another, you have to prove a clear line of causation between two people. So what you're looking for in these cases is showing that police officer X shot individual Y, and that police officer Z had commanded that officer, and so you go up the chain of command, and you have to show a clear line of causation. The problem is that, you know, a judge can only decide a case on the basis of the evidence presented to the judge. The problem is that in many cases, the evidence is not presented. And more importantly, what you have in a situation like a mass uprising like this, like the situation we saw in Bahrain, is that lines of command break down, but more importantly, the law doesn't envision this kind of a situation. The law isn't geared to deal with a mass uprising and to be able to provide remedies for a situation like that. And that's why you have transitional justice. You know, you wouldn't need transitional justice if normal justice was adequate, and it simply isn't. You know, the various Egyptian regimes, both transitory and more permanent elected regimes, whether it's Morsi a year, none of them really took any serious measures to enact transitional justice measures. So I would say that that's the primary reason, but there are many other complicated issues that go with that.
So I'm going to take you actually in a very different direction, knowing a little bit about your background, so I'm taking advantage of that. And that is, Lillie's film is the first instance that I have seen in which the labor movement is represented, and the work of the labor movement is represented as precursor to what we have seen in Egypt in the last 3 years. I lived in Cairo in 2007, 2008, and the great hope was that labor is coming back into its own. So if you can comment a little bit on labor movement in Egypt, and perhaps actually also on the socialist movement in Egypt. There is one of the independent reporters that was presented in here in interview is identified by, when he opens the door into a room, it's actually a socialist organization, and I would like to hear more perhaps about the movement of socialism today in Egypt, and about the labor movement and how effective they were leading up to the revolution, and where they stand today, and where do we put them in the map, in the political map of Egypt.
Okay. So yeah, I think it's a great. I think it's truly one of the few documents, historic documents, that talk about the Egyptian revolutions while putting some emphasis on the labor movement. Whenever I talk about the forces behind the Egyptian revolution, and that's what Lillie is doing, the story behind the Egyptian revolution, I talk about the labor movement, and I think that this is something that we cannot ignore. Of course, people bring in the case of Tunisia. This is something that you mentioned earlier. And Tunisia is definitely a case that is where labor movements are much better organized than in Egypt. They have solid grassroots movements, and they have been more influential in fomenting the Tunisian revolution and in keeping them, or playing an important role in shaping the country's current political landscape than is the case in Egypt, actually. But still, Egypt, I think we already have scholarly documentation of that. The number of labor protests in the years leading up to the revolution, they were increasing every year, and they reached record numbers actually in 2010, 2010, right before the revolution. And even after the revolution, there are still lots of labor protests and labor. There's a strong presence by the labor movement on the political landscape, but it's not as well documented as before the revolution. I think that the story that you documented in particular, that really brought up in her film, of the first independent syndicate of the real estate tax collectors. I think it was considered in Egyptian in the Egyptian political culture before the revolution as a huge success story. It was the first independent syndicate or first independent trade union since the 50s, when basically in Egypt you only have state-run or state-owned, state-run unions. And so, and that came after a lot of mobilization. So, Kamal Abu Aita, who was the head of that mobilization, of that syndicate, is currently the current minister of labor in the current government in Egypt. Some consider that to be a huge success for the revolution, that someone who was a labor figure, really, who worked all his life as a labor activist, became part of the governing coalition or the ruling coalition after Morsi, and now is a minister. But he has come since then under a lot of attack too. He's got a lot of fire from many people, who, including former labor activists and supporters, who now accuse him of becoming a sellout, if you will, for the military-backed government. Socialists, yes. What we see, Mustafa Bassiouni, who opens the office to Markaz Afaq Ishtirakiyya, or the center called Socialist Horizons, which is basically an organization, well, that's called the Revolutionary Socialists, or Socialist Revolutionaries in Egypt, and they're basically Trotskyites, the Trotskyist movement.
So were, by the way, very active on MIT campus in the 70s.
Yeah, okay, I didn't know that. the Socialist Revolutionaries?
The Trotskyists.
Okay, not from Egypt though. Okay, but they're not. But they are not. Well, it's an important faction, definitely in the Egyptian left over the past couple of decades, but it's not the only faction. There are several other leftist and socialist factions in Egypt. And we now see, there is of course another socialist party, an important socialist party called, which was established after the revolution, called the Tahaluf al-Ishtiraki, or the Socialist Alliance, and the Tayar al-Shabi, the Popular Current. So these are socialist movements and parties that were formed after the revolution, but that represent certain forces, certain leftist forces that existed, predated the revolution. The problem is that, and we also see center leftist parties. One of them is the Egyptian Social Democratic Party, which has its leftist leanings, but social liberal leanings as well. So it's not really socialist, but. The leftist movement has seen a lot of fragmentation over the past few years. It has always suffered from that, phenomenon of being fragmented and unable to really coalesce or come together around one particular goal, and it's probably because of the ideological divides. They're too ideological, the dogmas, and that's something that is certainly lamentable. But I think apart from the ideological divides and the dogmas, it's important to focus on the role of labor movements, and this is something that we rarely see in anybody who studies the Egyptian Revolution or any other revolution actually in the Arab world or the Middle East. And they definitely play an important role. In April 2008, and this was the name of the April 6th youth movement, this is when this huge strike happened in Mahalla, and it was also it reached other parts of the country as well. And I think that in 2008 it was the hugest mobilization before 2011. We saw tens of thousands of people take to the streets, tear down Mubarak's posters, and it was really, we were that close to really shaking the ground behind below the regime. But it took 3 more years for this to actually, for us to see a real change. Yeah, I don't know if that answers.
Adel, I left you for the more difficult question, and that is, here we have an American citizen with an American citizen's agenda going to Egypt and covering the build-up toward the revolution, which she didn't know was going to happen when she was there. And she actually has her agenda at the tip of her fingers. She's not hiding any of what she is about, and I personally sympathize with what she was doing there, which is, first of all, looking at funding and who's funding who and for what purpose, and second, to tell the Americans that, look, if you really are advocating or wanting to advocate democracy in the world, you have to change your policy, especially your financing policy. But this is not the gist of my question. I actually want to take you, or I want to take all of us, back into the coverage of what was going on in Egypt and what went into in Egypt in 2011 and on. You wrote a book on Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera is such a controversial presence today in Egypt with its very open agenda supporting one side, if you want. And I would like to hear your insight, if it's possible, on the role of the citizen informant, as Lillie Paquette is, and the role of the media in how we form our opinion about what went on in Egypt, how all of us get our information, and whether actually a project such as Lillie's is a response to the dominant media coverage.
Wow, that is a very difficult question. I wish you wouldn't have left me the last. Okay, so if I may, I'd like to actually compartmentalize it in such a way that so I can manage the question. I think probably largely because of the way in which language is sometimes used and contorted, especially in relation to the Egyptian Revolution. The Egyptian Revolution has sort of a whole glossary or a vernacular of its own. So the term agenda often has very negative connotations, especially because the Mubarak regime would often, or at least the media during the 18 days would often accuse the protesters in Tahrir Square of having quote-unquote agendas, irrespective of what the agenda means, right? So I think maybe if we were to use a term like objectives or aims in the case of what Lillie intended to do, I think being transparent and open about your project, especially when you go out to shoot a documentary, and I imagine this was probably your debut, right? This is your first major film?
Yeah, it's my first film.
First film? Okay. And you know, it seems as though your original intention was to evaluate the extent to which these public diplomacy projects are having any sort of effectual outcome on the ground. Is that correct?
I was trying to be a little snarky with that comment, because I kind of was saying, I kind of wanted to like shed light on it and show like that it isn't helping kind of thing, but...
Yes.
Yeah.
And it feels to me, at least having watched the film, that the subtext that runs throughout seems to imply that whatever support, financial support, is going towards these youth activists, these sort of democratization groups, the Egyptian Democratic Academy and organizations of the sort, or the trainings that have now become such sort of a testament to the state's and the regime's critique of the revolutionary movement as a whole. Today, unfortunately, 80% of the individuals who are featured in this film as activists are either behind bars or being pursued or being prosecuted somehow, or have decided to go into to silence for fear of retribution. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the regime's problem alone or the current government's problem alone, but they've been incriminated over the past 3 years by consecutive governments and consecutive authorities for a variety of different reasons. And because of the extreme sort of confusion surrounding the narrative of the revolution in Egypt, no one isn't a fallen star, if you will. So in a moment in time, exactly, in fact, just before the June 30th protest, there was a gentleman who was in the middle of one of the shots. His name is Ahmed Doma. He was literally in the background. I didn't even realize he was featured in this film, but the camera kind of pans across. And he was one of the people who was extremely active in mobilizing for the removal of Morsi from office. And now he's in jail and faces a 3-year sentence for participating in an illegal protest. So all of this to say that whatever the agenda may have been, whatever the objectives of this film may have been, I think what it does critically well is to really sort of disentangle what appears to be sort of and to borrow the word from sort of the legal nomenclature, the causal relationship between funding and political outcomes. So whether the US government supports the Mubarak regime, does that necessarily translate into political stability? If the US government supports pro-democracy activists, does that translate into democratization? And then you can take that and look at it wave after wave. And Egyptians today are just as confused as they were back then about where the US government stands on any issue. You saw Bassem at some point saying, or actually I think it was Ayman Noor, said the Obama administration is confused. The US administration appears as confused now as it was then on Egypt. And it's largely because of the incredible tumult of Egypt, which makes it extremely difficult to document. Which brings me to your second question about documentation. Documentation seemed so incredibly easy and so incredibly linear when we had two obvious polarities. You had, media love sort of dichotomies and binaries. You have a demonic, tyrannical, authoritarian regime that's been in power for 30 years, if not longer. Depending on where you draw the starting point. It could be 1952, it could be 1919, it could be 7,000 years ago. And then of course the other side are the young, naive, ambitious, highly aspirational youth who just want to tear this down and live out this dream that they have. And unfortunately, as time goes on, we realize that narratives are far more complicated and discourses are not so easy. Al Jazeera fits into that sort of dynamic because, at least as during my early research on the network, the station was or at least the Arabic iteration of the station was deeply committed to the downtrodden, the subjugated, the marginalized, and so it became a platform for oppositional voices in the Arab world across the board, and also provided a platform for the regimes to respond and to engage in dialogue. But a lot of it represented political theater. So you take these debate shows where they turn into boxing matches, if you will, on TV. It made for extremely dynamic coverage at a time when authoritarian media was so bland, so unimaginative, and so problematic. But fast forward a number of years, especially since the rise or the beginnings of the uprisings in 2011, and we have a station or a community of stations that are now beholden to sort of a developing political agenda. And this political agenda is determined from above in the same way that many of the other authoritarian state broadcasters operate. So we've seen since 2011, particularly when it comes to Egypt, that Al Jazeera Arabic, precisely, and to a lesser extent some of the English language stations, Al Jazeera English in America, becoming much more fervent in their support of a singular political group within the Egyptian spectrum. And that, of course, means that they then become part of the political competition in the Egyptian sort of maelstrom, which is a very different story entirely. When we talk about journalistic professionalism, we talk about the ability to relay competing perspectives, competing worldviews, competing life worlds. And that, of course, was the advantage that Al Jazeera had back when it was committed to delivering that. Eventually, it fell into the same trap that most other politically involved, engaged, funded, and sponsored news organizations in the Egyptian scene, both state and private, and became a political player, which means that by and large, it leaves a lot of Egyptians who are less inclined to being partisan or prefer to be partial in favor of the highly lofty values of human dignity and social justice and things of that sort, lost in this sort of cacophonous space. The only thing that really we've gained as an advantage is the fact that now we have young people with, and not so young people as well, with cameras that are able to document their immediate engagement with physical material realities. That is, but whether or not it fits and coheres in such a way that it presents a complete picture, that depends on the broadcaster. Today, if you watch Al Jazeera, Arabic precisely, or more so, you're able to see one version of reality on Egyptian politics. You turn on the Egyptian state television, you get another version on reality, and then you watch the private networks, and you get sort of a narrow spectrum, but they're literally little tiny slices of reality, all of which are basically a composite of broadcasting that operates within the studio, so studio production, and citizen journalism on the ground. Every single network resorts to citizen production today. So it is no longer a novelty, and it's no longer necessarily a monopoly of the dissenting or the opposition. Everyone uses it, the state as well as its immediate adversaries.
Thank you. You managed to actually dissect my question and answer every point of it. So it wasn't that difficult after all. I'm going to ask just actually one question of Lillie and then ask each and every one of you to comment on the same question and then open the floor for the audience. But before that, it seems that Lillie has managed to resist the photogenic appeal of Ayman Noor, and she ended up not having actually a film focused on one figure as some of the media outlet that you were talking about would focus on one agenda or one side of the story. Because at the beginning I actually felt that Ayman Noor is taking more time on the screen than anyone else. And my question to you is really what you have actually said openly is what made you do this film. And that is the sources of funding, but in particular, because we are here and we are interested in how the United States of America deal with Egypt, is how the United States of America has funded or been involved in the funding of political action in general, whether it is on the part of the government or on the part of some of the NGOs that have benefited from different organizations funded by different branches of either the American political structure or other sources in the US. And I want to just comment on one thing. I mean, we heard different and controversial opinions at some point, but also contradictory opinions at other point where people are saying, give us money, but don't interfere in our politics or something like that. It seems to me one of the clearest statements came from that woman candidate, independent candidate that lost the elections. And I would like your comment specifically on her comment, and that is something that I personally have felt traveling around the eastern part of the Arab world, that the desire of the majority of the educated individuals, and I'm actually being very careful in using this term, is to ask the United States to have a hands-off policy in the Arab world. Is this something that you felt, and how do you react in a sense to the diversity of opinions that we've seen in here and the contradiction in some of them about wanting and not wanting the US to be involved? And then actually I want each and every one of you to comment on that.
Thanks for that question. That's really at the root of everything I've been trying to do here. And there's so many different ways I can go in answering that. And I guess I'll start with the Ayman Noor piece. the reason I brought Ayman Noor up is not so much because I wanted to tell his story, but I felt like his story, in particular, really demonstrated this point that I was trying to make. We had Condoleezza Rice put her foot down and say, I'm not coming to Egypt, release him, he's the liberal voice, you should let him, you know, speak up. And then, what I'm trying to focus on there, and I know it goes by really fast, and there's a lot of information thrown at the viewer, and I know that it's kind of dense with that, and it goes, but what I'm really trying to show there is this, I guess this card, this chip that the US uses for, I would argue, its own political game. And international affairs is a chess game. You move one thing, you got to move the other. You win, you lose. Who are my friends? Who aren't? And I just feel like, well, I don't feel like I've been studying about this for a long time. That in the case of supporting or not supporting a particular ruler in a country, the U.S. has a long record of supporting dictators or clamping down on them when they feel like it. So I guess that's the main point. That's the main reason I'm bringing the Ayman Noor story up. And interestingly, and I just want to say, like, for a lot of you here know me, I guess, and have seen the film in other times in different states of its development. But I feel like I could have made any character in the film. I could have made a whole story about them. Or like the labor movement. I could have made a whole film about the labor movement. I've interviewed so many labor activists. There's only like maybe a 3-minute slot that I get to put in an hour and 25 minutes on each subject. And the sound bites are so short. And I, in some ways, I didn't want to make this film at all after having been there all that time, because I was like, there's no way I can represent the truth here and the opinions and the different points of view and the different perspectives. So back to the, I don't know how I got to that point, but back to the Ayman Noor piece, which interesting, oh yeah, here it is that I got to know him very well as well. And I got to know his family, and I got to know his ex-wife, who's Gamila, who's the woman in the final comment. I don't know if you know that, but that's his ex-wife.
No, I don't.
And that's why I kind of diplomatically say she's, got ties to the Al-Ghad party, but she had started her own, she'd run as an independent. So long, that could be a whole telenovela.
We're going to have some juicy information coming from there.
Okay. It gets pretty, it gets pretty intense being in any situation, but in Egypt, among all these people all the time, getting to know all their stories, getting to know them personally, trying to walk this fine line of being an objective observer, which is what I always claim to be. I'm an objective observer, when the people are like, no, you're an activist, no, you're a CIA agent or whatever I got accused of. But what was interesting in the case of Ayman Noor is that his son actually told me. His son he's a bunch of cameos in the film. His son was on the cover of Time magazine during the revolution. He's a really activist kid who totally doesn't want to be defined as his father's son because he wants to be his own, activist on his own right. But he had told me during one interview that in fact, the U.S. meddling with his father's case was the worst thing that could have happened to his dad. He's like, if only Condoleezza Rice had just shut up and kept her mouth shut and stayed out of our story, we would have been much better off. Sure, maybe my dad would have been released right away or whatever, it would have calmed down, but instead the U.S. had to put their big foot in and say, oh, release the little liberal guy or else. And then of course that turned him into, in many ways, a bigger issue in the story, whereas he wouldn't have gotten that kind of traction, maybe, or maybe he would have, who knows. But it's true. I'm not putting him in the film saying he's such an important figure in Egyptian politics. I put him in the film focusing on what it is that the U.S. is doing when they jump in and they say, do they have clout? And this is a question that I've had for many years as well. I've been following his story for, since he was imprisoned, because that's when I sort of started my studies in grad school on the subject. And for me, it was interesting seeing the support or lack thereof from the U.S., depending on the political climate at the time. And so what happened, and which I focused on as well, is the second time around when he was imprisoned, did the U.S. even say anything or do anything? No, because by then things had calmed down. They had already kind of, tooted the horn of democracy. Now it's on to other things, and of course it's also, again, this juggling act that's going on. And then back, I guess I'm going to try to narrow back to, you guys some space, but back to the comment at the end by Gamila Ismail, where she's just like, just stay away. I mean, it's true. Everybody wanted that as well. People were always, and I think that it was so complicated because it wasn't black and white, and it wasn't always the same narrative. It was always depending on what was happening at the time politically. So, and I say that in the end, I often heard this narrative, I heard that kind of comment, especially when things were riled up, for two reasons. Well, millions, but I'm going to say two. The Egyptian government is receiving all this aid from the US, both economic aid and also military aid, for the last 30 plus years. And yet, whenever something like this was going on, something that they love to do is call the young people, or call anybody like I know who's getting support from the West, or from the US, agents of the West. And I'm like, agents of the West? What about you guys? Like, these kids are getting like peanuts in comparison to what you're getting. But interestingly, you'd think that that would be obvious to the public. But no, like, a country like Egypt where the mass population doesn't or hasn't had access to all the different perspectives. We talk about Facebook and Twitter informing Egyptians. Well, I mean, when you look at a country that has, I don't remember all the illiteracy population, people who depend basically on state media. People aren't always reading Facebook and Twitter as much as we like to say that here in the West. So people who don't have access to all that information, and who most of their information comes from TV or radio that they don't have to be able to read it about, they're getting targeted by the Egyptian government with a narrative. And they have a perspective on what they're seeing and so if they hear the Egyptian government through the media, supposedly free media, saying, yes, these are agents of the US, and the reason that we have all this trouble is because of the US and Israel, well, possibly true, but at the same time, they're not telling their population, but guess what? We're being funded as well by the US, and you better like protest against the US because, so it's this weird like scramble of like pointing fingers and different interests and different perspectives. So, yeah, I don't think I can have a definite answer on that, except that I saw a lot of this problem of at one point people going, yeah, sure, we appreciate U.S. pressure. We want it, like Bassem was saying at one point. We just want pressure. Why don't the U.S. come in and give pressure like they did in 2005? And then on another point, he's saying, stop this funding for democracy, and then at the same time, he's receiving it. There was a lot of that, and I think they were just as aware of it as I am, because they're very informed and aware. But I guess like Esra's like sigh in her bedroom, that was like key for me. I saw that a lot, like just like, does the US support democracy? And she's like, and she knows what I'm about to ask her, because she knows that I just asked her if Ned is giving her money, and Ned is giving her money, and yet she's got to have this, she's got to support what she's doing, but she also knows it's complicated.
We'll hear actually three opinions. I want to hear all three of you actually on the money trail. This is really where I want to stop my own questioning and turn the floor to the audience, but each and every one of you, 2 minutes basically, telling us a little bit.
Very, very briefly, I think that the question of funding was a very controversial issue among opposition forces in Egypt before the revolution in particular, and it started in the 90s, and it was really not only the opposition, but civil society in general, and human rights organizations, and then pro-democracy organizations, and then there was a huge divide really between those who saw that this whole thing, receiving pro-democracy and human rights funding from the US was not something that civil society organizations should do in Egypt, because you would be just catering to the US agenda. Even if it's for some sham human rights or democracy in Egypt, and there were others on the other hand who saw that no, it's something that we can do something using some funding from the U.S. and other the EU too, and other international organizations as well. But I would say that Isra and Bassem's position on funding and stuff, it was not necessarily the most popular among Egyptian opposition forces at the time. Most opposition forces at the time saw that as a very problematic relationship with foreign aid or foreign funding when it comes to democracy, pro-democracy efforts. But on the other hand, of course, most opposition forces and activists were like, okay, this whole thing is screwed up because as you said, the U.S. is giving money, much more money, to the government and to the military, and just giving some pocket change to civil society organizations for some confused agenda or not so confused agenda that the U.S. has. So yes, many people their position was, leave us alone, just back off. What we would like the U.S. to do is to leave us alone. Do not support the dictators, just as Gamila Ismail said. And you know what? We don't really need your money after all, because, but again, as I said, it was a controversial issue. There was no consensus on that.
Sorry. It's all the same name for one person as well. Yes.
I'm going to dispel two myths. This question of funding, especially in the American mind, creates the impression that the US government is propping up the Egyptian regime. There's this popular assumption that if tomorrow morning the US government or Congress were to suspend all these aid programs to Egypt, Egypt would collapse. That's baloney. And let's break down the numbers. I'm talking here official aid to the Egyptian government. So it's $1.3 billion annually in military aid. Now that's not $1.3 billion in cash. You don't have suitcases flying in unmarked aircraft flying to Egypt, and giving to the government. That's not the case. Really what's happening is that $1.3 billion is broken up into officer training programs. It is broken down into repair and maintenance of equipment that was sold to Egypt over the past 30 years. It is new equipment in what is called the Peace Vector program, and there have only been 4 of those programs where Egypt's, for example, Air Force receives 4 or 5 new F-16 fighter Falcons, right, instead of Su-21s that were Soviet built, okay? So that amount of money is simply not a lot of money by military terms. In terms of military hardware, $1.3 billion is not a lot of money. Again, if you look at the budget of the Egyptian military, it's not that critical, all right? And when the Obama administration suspended the aid, nothing happened, all right? So there's this impression that, stay away, don't support the dictator. It wasn't the money. Because, you were asking about the money trail.
Yeah.
It's not the money. It's not about the money. As to the economic aid, it was, the economic aid was at the level of over $1 billion in the 80s. And it has continuously decreased very progressively. The last that I know, I don't really follow the numbers very, very carefully, but it is well below, I think it's somewhere around the amount of $500 million or something of the sort, and it's not even, it's being restructured in the way that it becomes some kind of a joint fund that funds educational programs. So it's a very, very small amount of money. For any of us, it's a lot of money, but in terms of government funding, it's a tiny amount of money compared, for example, to what Egypt receives from the Gulf.
Yes.
Okay, so in terms of monetary leverage, the US had never been propping up the Egyptian government. And if you compare the amount of money and hardware that the Egyptians say were receiving from the Soviets, it was much larger than the American aid programs. But again, I'm talking very specifically about the money, not talking about the political support or what that means. That's one point. The other point, not the second myth, I'll get to the second myth, but the other point is that the money being received, that military aid, its purpose is much more symbolic, and its purpose is much more political than monetary. its purpose is to keep Egypt within the broader orbit of the Western world. It's not monetary, right? It's the point of Egypt is the, whether we like it or not, it is the linchpin of the Arab world. In a very turbulent region with Iraq, Iran, Sudan is breaking up, the situation in Israel, Palestine, and the peace process. These are all very important issues for any U.S. administration. And I think it's perfectly legitimate for any U.S. administration to put its strategic interests first, right? Because it's very easy for people to criticize an administration for funding the dictators, but it's also very important to look at what the strategic dimensions are. All these issues just get forgotten in the background. So that's one myth. The second myth is the Egyptian government. I don't believe in the word regime, because I don't think there is any government that is, well, maybe North Korea, but barring some outlying exceptions, it's very hard to find a government that is a monolith. And I say that to tell you the juicy story about Ayman Noor, which is no longer a secret. What's his name, Besson? Besson was saying that democracy in Egypt would be much better under the Republicans than the Democrats, right? Well, look at when Ayman Noor was released. Ayman Noor did not complete his term, his prison term. He was released very early in the first months of the Obama term. And that's something that I witnessed, that I saw the inner workings of how that happened. And it's no longer a secret. It was written in the memoirs of Egypt's foreign secretary at the time. And the fact is that there were a number of agencies in the Egyptian government that were pushing continuously for his release, because it's a completely senseless act of political naivety, really, by the regime to do that. It means nothing. It really.
You used the word regime.
Huh?
You used the word regime.
You're right. I did. You're right. No, but you're right. By certain elements in government that we're looking at things in a very narrow and tactical sense, and so it's no longer a secret. The fact is that the foreign secretary managed to convince Mubarak once Obama came into office that the Congress, and it really wasn't the administration, but it was Congress that had been pushing very much for Ayman Noor's release. This would be a sign of goodwill to Congress, and we can do it almost as a sign to Congress that under the Obama administration, which was much more delicate in dealing with human rights issues, that approach pays off, and we're going to do this as a sign of goodwill. So actually, Besson was wrong. That at least at the time, if we're commenting on what was going on at the time, no, a light footprint is what a lighter footprint diplomacy actually paid off. Under the Bush administration, never paid off.
Thank you. And in your 2 minutes.
Two? That's it? That's all I have? 2 minutes? Okay.
Sorry.
No, it's quite all right. I'm just going to say that I agree with almost everything that I've heard thus far, and to add to it, I'm sort of going to skip around a few points. I agree with what Muhammad, also known as Ahmed, said on the issue of funding. In a sense, the U.S. funding for governments in the region, but precisely for Egypt, was primarily symbolic all the way through. And this is the case in consecutive governments. It means that relations are good and solid. It also legitimizes this government in the sort of strategic sense, and it also forms the kind of connections that allow it to stay within the orbit. But I will argue that there is a distinction between supporting the Mubarak government and supporting the current interim government, and I say that for a variety of reasons. Mubarak had obviously started to lose a significant amount of support on a public level, and that became increasingly obvious, both from anecdotally and in terms of the last presidential elections, where Ayman Noor started to garner some support, and the labor movement, as Soha explained, and all of what we know. And so in a sense, to prop up and legitimize a government that was evidently ailing was a strategic decision, and not a particularly smart strategic decision. If one were to think of the US decision making as purely pragmatic, purely realist, and purely self-interested. And that is quite different from what happened in consecutive periods. But again, we see that the US government is sort of I don't know how to describe it really, but there's no real barometer for where things are going to go in Egypt, which renders the whole discussion over what should and should not be funded from a purely US government perspective a much more confused question. So what the US has effectively done, and it started doing so before, obviously when MEPI began expending all of this money, was to basically support every horse in the race with aggregated amounts of money that are determined by the extent to which this is a winning bet. Okay, so if this, obviously the NDP horse is the strongest and most capable, the Muslim Brotherhood to a lesser extent, and then you've got these smaller democracy activist folks who you can, throw them with crumbs on the table, and it's quite all right. And in the end, if your horse wins, then you celebrate and you cash in, which is what the US government often does. So when the quote-unquote democracy movement, the April 6th movement, all of these folks appear to have sort of emerged victorious. Even in the case of Wael Ghunaim, the Google executive who became sort of the superhero and the star of the genuine 25th revolutionary movement, all of a sudden you have a US government, or a position at least, in many offices of the US government that are patting themselves on the back and saying, congratulations, these are the folks that we helped support, and an attempt to take credit for the fact that we did so. Now, if this were to have faltered, and if there was significant failure on that front, then you would hear offices within the US government that would try to cover the tracks, basically saying, oh, sorry, that really wasn't us. That was a whole other sort of dynamic. So in the end, I think the problem that we have here is that the funding will continue. And it will continue to every competitor on the political field. But we have to keep in mind that not only is it becoming less sort of correlated with success on the ground. Now we're seeing an emboldened Egyptian government that speaks in not so sort of mild terms about not wanting US aid whatsoever. You can cut the military aid. There are in fact campaigns in Egypt that are supported by various instruments and apparatuses of the state that say, we don't want funding at all. In fact, we don't even want IMF loans. We don't want the World Bank. We don't want structural adjustment. We don't want any of these things. That there is a growing sort of economic isolationism, which arguably is a very difficult decision for a country that is undergoing significant economic turmoil. But of course the money is coming in from other sources. But is that sustainable? So the question here is the Egyptian government prepared to take the necessary risk to sever its economic ties with the international community so as to reify its own perceived legitimization? So rather than seeking legitimization through international consensus, we have an Egyptian government that is prepared to be isolated and prepared to be discredited just because it believes it's in its own best interest. So I think there are important considerations. What the U.S. government is now negotiating, and I know that there's been discussion in the White House literally like 3 or 4 days ago over severing all sort of aid to Egypt. And at the same time, the U.S. government is concerned that if that were to happen, then there would be no more strings attached to Egypt.
Interesting thought to bring us to the present. I have 7 more minutes, and I know Tariq wants to have an announcement at the end. There are 2 mics here for members of the audience who would like to ask questions, but I would ask you to actually direct your question to a specific person and have a question, not a comment, except if you want to tell Lillie how intelligent and thought-provoking the film is, but otherwise I don't want any comments, and please be brief for the interest of time.
I would like to speak to the former diplomat on the panel about what the influence of events in Turkey may have been on El-Sisi and the coup. Do you think that the rigged trials, at least some of them were rigged against Turkish military by the Turkish Islamist government, convinced the Egyptian military to do what it may not have decided to do earlier, and safeguard its place in society and freedom from perhaps future rigged trials of, to stage. Do you think that was a part of its motivation of staging a coup, lest the Morsi government follow the advice of its Turkish advisors?
Well, I'm not a former diplomat. I'm still technically on the service, but I'm not in service, which is an odd place to be. I'm not very comfortable also with describing the events of June 30th as a coup d'etat, but that's another polemical debate we can get into. But I don't think the events in Turkey, insofar, that aspect of events in Turkey that you're describing, the trials of former military officers in Turkey, I don't think that particularly had much of an impact on anything in Egypt. I think I would really have to stretch my imagination to see how events in Turkey were impacting the situation in Egypt. Really, if anything, I would say it's the other way around. You know, I think events in Egypt, you can see a very latent ripple of almost an echo of what's happening in Egypt in Turkey. I think the fact that the Erdogan government is significantly weakened has emboldened the army. The army had a very interesting and subtle message that it came out with just 2 weeks ago. And that caused a retrial of many of the former military officers because Erdogan feels much more precarious. I think the Turkish military is thinking, oh, look at that, you know. Look at what's happening in Egypt. You know, this feels interesting. We don't need to have our generals being prosecuted anymore. So I think really it might be the other way around. You know, that's just my help.
Stephen Campbell from the Fletcher School. Lillie, great job. And your third version, I think I've seen of the film. The question for, is it Ahmed?
It's my mistake, it's Mohammed.
I'm sorry.
It's Ted or George, whatever.
Okay, Fred. So I'm wondering about where we are with Al-Qaeda in this tumultuous to and fro in the Middle East and Egypt in particular, given Sawari's background and the nature of Al-Qaeda and the Egyptian element within it. I was very heartened in 2011 when the revolution happened, and I thought, well, this discredits bin Laden's narrative. We don't need violence to create positive change. But we've now come full circle, and the Islamists are now laughing and saying, see, I told you. We need violence. And the Islamists are rushing to fill this violence, especially with what's going on in Syria. First of all, it was Iraq, now it's Syria, and Yemen, Mali, and so on. So my question is, where does Egypt play a role in this extremism? Are we going to get a return to the near enemy? Al-Qaeda went towards the far enemy because Gamma Islamiyya and Islamic Jihad were pretty much put out of business in the 90s by the Mubarak regime. Now we've got a slightly softer, but Al-Sisi is yet to be seen just how he's going to lead things. Are we going to see a return to Al-Qaeda and extremist attacks within the homeland of Egypt?
You know, prediction is
I'll let this question go, even though it's actually totally out of the topic of the session in here, so please a very brief answer.
very brief. Prediction is a very perilous business, but I put Al-Qaeda aside. I think we've already seen a resurgence of the pattern of terrorism and Islamist violence that Egypt had witnessed in the mid-90s, sort of late 80s, mid to late 80s, and throughout the 90s until pretty much 1997, with one twist, which is a more problematic situation in northern Sinai, which is a bit of a different style of Islamist violence. The groups there are not exclusively Egyptian. The kinds of equipment and hardware that they have is not just rudimentary built explosive devices, but it's much more, in military terms, it's a much more kinetic situation. So I think that's the newer element, and I think that is where the government is also going to be focused, because it impacts regional security quite detrimentally.
Thank you.
Hi. Any one of the panelists is welcome to answer what I'm about to ask. One of my cousins, who was a member of Iran's imperial court, who happened to know Mubarak back when he was a military officer under Sadat, always reminds me that the day Mubarak handed over power to the military was on the anniversary of Khomeini seizing power in Iran. Now, like Egypt and Iran, one thing the situation had in common: America backed the opposition, and another thing both situations had in common was that the incidents of brutality that we've seen in Egypt and Iran since each country's respective uprisings, all these incidents of brutality have been carried out by people in positions of power who are trained by people in America to commit these acts of brutality. Now, since you feel we're American trained, shouldn't America get its own act together before America is going to provide any aid whatsoever to Egypt and anywhere else in the region?
I hope you're not assuming Ahmed.
But there's relief this time.
Okay. I think the sort of the discussion of similarity and coincidence and the parallels between the two. Of course, I mean, the Sisi has been trained, as are a significant proportion of Egypt's top military corps over the past 30-some years since the signing of the Camp David Accords. But we're starting to see a different sort of tone coming out of the Egyptian military as of late. And there's no hiding the fact that there is sort of a growing sort of ultra-nationalist discourse that's coming out of the military in Egypt that may appear to be contrary to the larger sort of considerations of where Egypt lies. But nevertheless, that doesn't necessarily mean that the military hasn't been engaged in a significant active suppression of a sizable proportion of the Egyptian population that disagrees with the current transition. So, I mean, this panel, incidentally, we haven't brought up the word Muslim Brotherhood thus far, and that, of course, is, the elephant in the room in one circumstance. And in addition to that, we also have, a problematic, situation in Egypt. So I don't want to speak to the issue of the relationship between Iran and Egypt and the U.S. funding. I think we've exhausted the discussion of U.S. funding both for the military and elsewhere. But nevertheless, one needs to shed light on the military as an institution in Egyptian society, the role that it's played thus far, and the role that it will continue to play, and the extent to which it's able to rally significant support at the expense of its own opposition, doing so with increasing hostility towards the United States. Now, I don't think most people in Egyptian society, I mean, given the favorability or unfavorability indexes that the United States has in Egypt, I mean, I think the latest Gallup poll has, 78% of Egyptians perceiving the U.S. in an unfavorable light, which is maybe a 10% increase from what it was before the revolution. So there's no sort of love lost if the military were to say goodbye to U.S. funding or vice versa. If the U.S. were to suspend military aid or any form of aid, as symbolic as it may seem, to Egypt, then the Egyptian society, as well as the institutions of the state, can actually rejoice in having cut that umbilical cord once and for all. So I don't know if it's going to produce anything favorable either way, but so I can't really answer your question comprehensively, but that's sort of where we stand in that strange equilibrium.
Since we actually have already run out of time, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to take your question. Just you'll be the last question. The gentleman at the mic. I'm sorry for if you were waiting for your turn. We're going to have to wrap up. But go ahead.
I would like to ask you a hypothetical question, if I may. Assuming it's 2009 and you're in charge of American foreign policy, I would like to know each of you, what steps would you have taken to help the Egyptian movement, and how much impact that would have had?
Can I start?
If you feel.
First of all, I'd do exactly what Gamila Ismail suggested, which is to back off, and I would quit.
Excellent. Would anyone care to add any comment?
The same, I guess. It's I'm not a fan of hypotheticals of the sort, but yeah, it's really backing off. It's really just leaving, and again putting into consideration the fact that actually the military aid or all that sort of aid to the government is actually benefiting the United States more than it's benefiting Egypt itself.
Look, yeah, I would concur with you on that. Like, I wouldn't say it's rational to say that the U.S. would ever just back off and stop. Mohammed said, that the money that's being passed on to Egypt is symbolic, and that's true. And I find in no way would I ever claim otherwise. It's a drop in the bucket, but it is symbolic. And Egypt is the second largest recipient of U.S. aid after Israel in the whole world. So aid means something in terms of it's a little chip you put down, it's you're my friend, you're not. The alliance with Egypt, between the United States and Egypt, is something that the U.S. had been seeking after for over 20 years during the Cold War period. And this was a time when there was spheres of influence between, you're either with the Soviets or you're with America. And the way I like to put that period and that time, especially with the case in Egypt, is I like to think of it as like the U.S. was kind of courting Egypt, and so was the USSR, and they both wanted her. Let's just say, use the parallel. But the U.S. won. The U.S. got it, but Russia had put lots of money into Egypt as well, and they had offered all kinds of things. And so for the U.S. basically was the winner. It gained its ally. This was a very important strategic ally, and the relationship, the aid relationship that exists between the United States and Israel isn't one that you can just say, you know what, we're cutting off the aid, because guess what? Yes, like you were saying, the aid is steeped in all kinds of deals, all kinds of, the Egyptian government orders like a fighter jet, and like 6 years later they get it, or maybe 7 or 8 years later they get it after it's built, and it's all, it's very complex the way it works. So I guess I would say, like, if I was Obama, I honestly think that when he came and spoke in Cairo in 2009, and I could go on and on about this because there's so many different things in the film that I would have liked to touch on with this, but when he came and spoke, and I remember when he was speaking, and I was still back in Washington, D.C., and I hadn't left my job to go to this film yet, and I was like, oh, no, don't say that, no, don't claim you're going to do that, no, you're a rookie, you're not going to be able to do all that stuff that you're saying you're going to do for the Middle East, and you're going to support democracy, and you're going to, there's a lot of stuff that I think that he went out and said, and which actually shot back negatively on his administration later when he wasn't able to come through with it, because these relationships are so much longer than an administration, a presidential administration. So yes, Obama was in between a rock and a hard place when he came in, and I think the next president will be as well, and this is just history, again, like that has a lot of background and a lot of future, so.
Thank you. I would like to thank my panelists, and I would like to thank Lillie for an intelligent, sensitive, and well-researched film that probably had raised all these questions and will raise more questions for all of us. I'd like to thank the Egyptian Student Association, the Agrican Documentation Center for making this event happen, and I will pass on and actually I would like to thank the audience that had lasted until 20 to 9. Thank you all, and Tarek has the mic.
We'd like to thank you for your moderation.
Thank you.
So, thank you very much, Professor Nasser. The only thing I want you guys to know, since you are all very interested in Egyptian economics, we have a very good surprise for you. We have, our next event is on the 25th this month. We have Egyptian billionaire Naguib Sawiris coming here to talk about doing business in the Middle East and Egypt. So please mark your calendars, 25th of February in the same auditorium. Thank you very much, and see you then.